Hi everybody, welcome to Mondays with Maya. This is episode 10, number 10. We are talking today about thin privilege and fat microaggressions and what that feels like for fat people living in a thin obsessed world. That is what we're talking about today. So hello, thank you for joining us. Thank you. Hi everybody. Okay, so what else did we want to talk about? Anything else before that? I can't remember. I feel like I had a bunch of other messages that I can't remember right now to get into. Okay, I know the hockey playoffs are starting right now. So thank you for giving me your attention during this playoff time. Okay, so let's start off by talking about thin privilege. What is it? What does it look like? How does it play into our lives? So I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of what thin privilege looks like. So for me, as a thin woman, I can pretty much go anywhere in public without the fear of being judged or ridiculed or shamed for how I look or what I may be eating. So for instance, I can eat as much as I want in any public setting, and I can do that without being judged. And there's a concept we talk about in sociology called food policing. So food policing ranges from any unprompted or unsolicited comments about what you're eating or what foods you may be putting in your grocery carts to more official food policies like restricting the size of your drinks. I know in New York, they tried to restrict the size of Slurpees, and there's been some movement to restrict the size of caffeine intake and that kind of stuff. So food policing ranges from unprompted, unsolicited comments or feedback on what you're eating, and it can range all the way up to more formal policies. But food policing is really all about approving of certain food behaviors and disapproving of other food and drink behaviors. You love my outfit. Thank you. Food policing is basically reminding us that the food we put into our bodies isn't really a private act, that it's for public consumption, that we are in the public view at all times. And to give you some more examples, so I could buy copious amounts of junk food at the grocery store, and no one's really going to comment to me about anything. I can go to a restaurant and eat the most processed, unhealthy food for me, and no one's going to say anything. I can ask for second and third servings, no one's going to say anything to me, right? I can eat hamburger and fries with a massive Coke or Pepsi, and I don't ever have to worry about somebody making a nasty comment to me in the food mall in the food court of a mall, right? And there's a sociologist named Deborah Lupton, and she's one of my favorite sociologists, and she often talks about how we can never separate public eating from the cultural expectations of what we think a healthy body should look like and what we think a healthy body should eat. So Deborah Lupton talks about how you can't divorce public eating from the cultural expectations around what we think healthy eating looks like, or what we think a thin body should eat, or what we expect a fat body to be consuming in public. And I mean, for instance, how many of us have chosen to eat differently in a public setting to offset what we think people think about it? So for instance, you'll eat a salad even though you're so hungry and you could really just eat a hamburger and fries, but you choose not to because you're worried about how people will perceive you, if they think you're gluttonous or that you're an overeater or you can't control yourself. So then you choose to eat differently in public. Some other examples of thin privilege. I can go to any clothing store in any mall, anywhere, and count on being able to buy a full outfit and not have to spend a fortune. Plus sizes are not found in every single store. In any given mall, certainly if you live in Ontario, any given mall will have over 200 stores in it, and you're looking at 6 to 8 stores maximum that offer anything above a size 12 or 14. And those clothes are much more expensive. I can join any dating app and be hooked up with somebody. I could work out at the gym and never worry about somebody making fun of my body, or never worrying about somebody taking a picture against my will, like that situation that happened in the States where a fat woman was working out and she was in the change room and some other woman took a picture of her and posted it online. That woman was eventually taken to court and charged. But that's just a thin privilege that I sort of take for granted at times, that I can walk into all these public spaces and never fear for my safety and never feel that I'm going to be shamed or ridiculed or judged or have pictures taken on me that then get put up on social media for other people to dissect. I can go into any classroom, any lecture hall, any auditorium, any theater, and sit comfortably in the seats. I can go into any airport or airplane and sit comfortably in those seats, never worrying about needing a seatbelt extender, never worrying about the sides of the seats pushing into my skin or causing bruises. I can always count as a thin person as seeing people who look like me represented everywhere I go. From movies, magazines, advertisements, brochures, in public spaces, in books, in cartoons, everywhere I go, I am constantly reminded of my presence and my value and my worth being validated in media. And all of these examples are advantages that are unearned by me simply through genetics. I am earning these privileges. And the thing with thin privilege is it's everywhere, right? It's everywhere. It's embedded in hiring practices and medical administrators and HR directors and counselors. And it's also restricting at the same time because fat discrimination, fat bias can restrict a person's health, finances, career opportunities, networking, socialization, their salary, their ability to get hired, promoted, fast-tracked, mentored, sponsored, all of that. So I first learned about what it feels like to be a fat person navigating a thin, obsessed world when I read the work of a scholar named Leslie Owen. And she wrote a phenomenal article that I use in my course every time I teach it. And she wanted to understand what it feels like. It was a qualitative study. What does it feel like to be fat in a world that fears fat, in a world that has such fat bias? And she came up with this term called spatial discrimination. And it was it's a form of fat microaggression. So a few weeks ago, we talked about microaggressions as this small nibbling away at your self-esteem. And I'm just going to read you a quote about what a fat microaggression is from her article. So it is a small nibbling away at a fat person's sense of worth, a constant wearing down as a result of small but continuous experiences of not fitting in, of feeling embarrassed, of having to demand accommodations or else not receive them at all. It's a smaller, less obvious form of violence, but it has many of the same effects, such as anger, frustration, guilt, fear, and loathing. Loathing toward the self and loathing toward others. So she did a study to see what it felt like. And she did this in a few different methods. She interviewed people. She had them fill out a diary. And then she spoke to them as they navigated their world. And so many of these people who participated in this study journaled, and then she analyzed their journal. And so what she found, which has been sort of reconfirmed with other studies, is that there are multiple coping mechanisms when you're a fat person dealing with fat bias and fat discrimination in the world. And so in this study, there were 3 main coping mechanisms for how these people, both men and women, dealt with being fat. And one was withdrawal. And withdrawal meant that these people opted to stay home more often than go through the incessant barrage of ridicule and critique and bullying that they faced on a daily basis. Sometimes it just got too much to deal with. And they said, you know what, I've sort of reached my maximum capacity and it's getting toxic and I'm just going to stay home. So to quote a participant, navigating a thin world felt like an obstacle course for them. They were constantly on the lookout for, whenever they walked into a room, where's the fat bias going to come from? Who in here hates fat people? Can they fit in between the lecture room rows? Will that chair hold me? Will that stall be big enough for me to get into? That's what they meant as an obstacle course. And they were constantly under the threat of snares and glares and nasty comments and unsolicited feedback on their appearance and people making negative comments, staring at them, ridiculing them, judging them. And she says that it required constant courage and motivation to deal with. And sometimes you just run out of courage and you run out of motivation to deal with all the hate that you get. And so these people at that point then chose to withdraw and to stay home. And the problem with that is then you have an absence of lived experiences of fat people. And then there's this sort of erasure of what they're going through. And Leslie Owen said that fat people's lives become unlived and their voices are unheard and they become symbolically dead because of that withdrawal to stay at home. I know every time I have brought in a body positive activist, they have shared their own personal stories of withdrawal. And until you've spoken to somebody who's gone through this on a regular basis, your thin privilege will shield you from this so badly. I am shocked at my own ignorance, shocked that I did not know this because I'm thin. Because I don't live this experience, which is why it's so important for us to be lifelong learners and to be growing and learning about other people's experiences. So I remember one time I asked 2 body positive activists to come in and give a talk, and they came in the morning. Actually, it was a night class. They came at night, and I asked them, to start to share their stories. And what they started talking about was something that I hadn't heard of until that point. And they said, well, we'd like to start off by talking about what happened to us today when we went to the store to get pizza and were crossing the street. And they were crossing the street as 2 visibly fat women. And they were at a stop walk, and a car was waiting for them to cross the stop walk. And they rolled down the window, and the guys in the car called them nasty names, told them to hurry up, move your fat ass. Why don't you get some exercise? You'd be able to cross the road a little faster. And then they threw garbage at them. They tossed empty bottles at them, old food that was in the car, a piece of pizza. And that's what happens on a regular basis. And I was shocked because I'd never heard of that. And I said, oh my gosh, this must be so rare. And they said, nope, actually almost every single day I cross the road, somebody makes a comment about me not moving my fat ass fast enough. And it's not uncommon for them to have something thrown at them. And yeah, Rosalie, I had the same, I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned that happens on a regular basis, and then stunned at my own ignorance that I did not know this was occurring. So the second coping mechanism that many fat people do to deal with this type of bullying and hatred that they deal with on a regular basis is they become invisible. And so that means that their own idea of what they need gets pushed down. So their bodily needs become invisible or not important. So even though fat bodies are hyper visible, their needs are invisible. So many of the people in this study talked about having to fight for accommodations on airplanes, having to fight for better seating at theaters or classrooms, and nobody really caring about whether or not they could fit into a seat, about whether or not the seats hurt them. And then I did sort of an anonymous survey in my own classes asking about how often my own university students sat in seats that physically hurt them, bruised them. They couldn't sit comfortably. Or those types of theater seats or university seats, college seats, where you sit in the desk and then the desk kind of like folds up and then goes down, and then you have to write on that little part that comes down, and how oftentimes they couldn't get it to go down and it wasn't comfortable and they couldn't physically sit for a 2-hour class, or they had no choice but to force their bodies into a space that really didn't accommodate them, and leaving the classroom every day with welts and bruises. There's been some research about how common that is for our students. So fat people tend to ignore, dismiss, and minimize their own needs, and they do that in order to sort of keep the status quo in social situations. And they tend to then lower their expectations, right? They reduce and ignore their own expectations of comfort, of inclusion, and thereby minimizing themselves. And then the third part is disembodiment. And this is when fat people in this study lived from the neck up. And this is, we mentioned this last week, when they didn't look in mirrors and they didn't want to take pictures, and they just only wanted to see themselves from the neck up. And this self-imposed lack of bodily awareness was meant as a mental, emotional shield from the harm that they were constantly being placed in. So a few years ago, there was a Twitter hashtag that was started called Fat Microaggressions. And this was started by a woman named Melissa McEwen. And so she started fat microaggressions as a hashtag, and you can look this up on Twitter, to sort of curate what the experiences of fat men and women who navigated a thin world. What does it feel like for you? What has happened to you? What are your experiences? And what she got were thousands and thousands of people tweeting all the different daily microaggressions that they dealt with. So I'll just read some of them out to you. You don't know me, says the stranger in the supermarket, but you really shouldn't eat what's in your shopping cart. And that's, as we just spoke about, food policing, how often strangers feel that they have the right to comment on what fat people are eating or what type of foods they're purchasing. I am constantly underestimated, said someone else. My intelligence, my strength, my talents, my tenacity, my cleanliness, and my humanity. Another one said, the bizarre excitement that people display when you've lost weight, like it's the only thing you've ever accomplished. And I've actually been guilty of that too, until I started listening and speaking with body activists and reading and learning about the literature around fat bias and discrimination. I thought it was a good thing to compliment somebody when they lost weight. But it's not the greatest thing to do for two main reasons. Is that we know that diets don't work, right? Something like 95% of people who go on a diet end up gaining the weight back and more within 5 years. And so what does that mean if you're complimenting them, how they look now? What does that mean when they were heavier? Were they not good enough to be complimented then? Were they not worthy enough of your attention then? And secondly is, I think so many of us would like the focus to be off our appearance and our body size and our body weight and more on who we are as human beings and our connection and our value, what we're contributing back rather than whether we look good in skinny jeans. One of the quotes from this fat microaggressions hashtag said, whether you're a little chubby or morbidly obese, you can expect to be insulted, ignored, and constantly underestimated by others. People will make assumptions about your health and your morals, your ethics, and your intelligence. And most of this fat shaming will be extremely subtle, woven into everyday conversations. If you want to know more about what it feels like and what the experiences of fat people are, I would highly encourage you to do three main things. One is to watch, it's like 3 minutes of your time, watch The Body Is Not an Apology. The Body Is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. She is a poet, an activist, an author. And if you Google or put into YouTube, The Body Is Not an Apology, you will see her spoken word art. And it's phenomenal. And I show it in every single class and it'll bring tears to your eyes. And if you type that into Google, you can get her printed poem because it's a lot and it's impactful, but you really have to dissect everything that she's saying because it's so layered and so nuanced. She also wrote a book and it's called The Body Is Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love. Everyone should read that book. And her website, The Body Is Not an Apology, is also a great forum for resources on everything related to body acceptance and body positive activism. Another thing would be to watch the HBO documentary called Stigma, The Human Cost of Obesity. And that's only 20 minutes and that's available on YouTube also. If you just type that into YouTube, you can watch it. It's called Stigma, The Human Cost of Obesity. And it basically looks at, again, what does it feel like? What are the experiences of fat people in a thin obsessed world. And then another one is called a fat rant, and that is by an actress and body activist called Joy Nash. She was actually, I think she filmed a few scenes in the Mindy Project when that was on. So her name is Joy Nash, and if you put into YouTube a fat rant, you can see both part 1 and part 2. If you just watch part 1, you'll still get a good idea of what she's talking about. It's only 8 minutes long, but I highly, highly suggest you do those 3 things to get more information on this topic. Okay, so now we can talk just a little bit about fat discrimination. So that I'm going to pull from this book called The Fat Studies Reader. So the Fat Studies Reader, in particular, I'm just going to read you some sections from the foreword, which was written by Marilyn Wan, and she's a pretty well-known body activist. She calls herself a fat activist, and it's depressing. It's depressing, basically, the stuff that I'm just going to read out to you, because weight-based discrimination is what she calls a cradle to grave phenomenon, because it starts when we're young and it continues across the life course. Girls as young as 5 fear getting fat, fear gaining weight. At age 10, fat children are chosen last by their friends and their peers in school. Fat children are more likely to be bullied or teased. And after years of being bullied and ostracized, fat teens can sometimes go the other way and then bully other people or tease other people. This is a quote: from nursery schools all the way through college, fat students experience ostracism, discouragement, even sometimes violence. They're often ridiculed by their peers and discouraged by even well-meaning education employees. Fat students develop low self-esteem and have limited horizons. Fatter children are sadder, lonelier, and more worried about school and their future, and face greater ridicule from gym teachers. Average weight children who fear becoming fat may eat too little, thereby slowing their own growth or delaying puberty. Fatter teens are also more likely to face deeply humiliating or shaming experiences that can increase their chances of developing depression. High school teachers are less likely to encourage fat students to apply to college or to have higher expectations of what they think fat students can achieve in their life. Colleges and universities are typically not at all aware or concerned about the needs of fat students' accommodations and seating, as we just spoke about. In one study, 93% of HR professionals said that they would hire a normal weight person over a fat person with the same qualifications, simply based on weight. 1 in 10 HR professionals thinks that it's okay to fire somebody based on their weight. We spoke about this last week, but there's very little stigma attached to joking about, making fun of fat people. Fat workers are paid less for working the same job, and they earn less money over the course of their life. College and university professors receive higher student evaluations if they also are better looking and thinner. In retail settings, studies have found that fat people will receive better customer service if they talk about dieting and losing weight rather than anything else. But if they are projecting what some term being a good fatty is, fitting into that idea of what we think fat people should be doing with their lives. So if they do that, they actually get more respect in retail settings. Isn't that absurd? It's harder for fat people to find rental options. Some studies, hi Marianne, some studies have shown that landlords are 50% less likely to rent to an equally qualified fat person. They're more likely to rent to the thin person. And then you've got all the fat discrimination and biases that occur in the medical setting, working with healthcare professionals that you think would be the most attuned to their own personal bias, and yet they're not. Imaging equipment like MRIs or CT scans often have weight limits, and for many people, certainly in the States, finding machines that can accommodate their higher weights are often left to the people themselves. The fatter a patient is, the more likely a surgeon is to leave sponges or even surgical instruments behind, an error that necessitates further surgery for 70% of such cases. Again, this is everything that I'm getting off of the Fat Studies reader book. It's horrifying for those of you who may not be aware of the fat discrimination that's out there. But the biased attitudes or the anti-fat attitudes of healthcare providers can also put fat people's lives at risk. Their physical health and their mental and emotional health can be negatively impacted by the anti-fat attitudes of healthcare professionals. For instance, doctors, when asked in an anonymous survey what they think of their obese patients, were more likely to call them lazy, willful, unable to follow orders. They made fun of them, basically. Many healthcare professionals have unexamined stereotypes about what they think fat people can do or are capable of. And these stereotypes aren't positive stereotypes, right? These are the stereotypes that we spoke about before of fat people as lazy, as not being able to have any willpower, as not being able to control things in their life. Mental health professionals are more likely to evaluate fat people as in a negative way. Fat women are 1/3 less likely to receive breast exams, pap smears, or gynecological exams, but are no less likely to receive mammograms. Now, why do you think that is? That fat women are less likely to get pap smears and breast exams, but they're not less likely to get a mammogram. Think about that for a second. The reason is because a breast exam requires that the doctor actually physically touch your breast, as a pap exam would have them touch your vagina, right? But a mammogram doesn't require the doctor to touch you at all. It's all done with machines. So that right there is an impediment. That's a barrier to your health. If you have a doctor who's unwilling to touch you, they could be missing cysts, they could be missing tumors, they could be missing all sorts of things that could be going wrong with you simply because of their own negative ideas about fat people. 12% of well-educated women reported delaying or avoiding altogether, canceling doctor's appointments because they knew that they would be weighed. And they just didn't want to go through that whole back and forth. Yeah, I'm here for allergies and the doctor wants to weigh me and tell me to lose weight. And it's like, no, just treat me the way you would a thin person who walked in with allergies. What would you do for a thin person with allergies? You wouldn't weigh them, but you're always weighing the fat person and telling them to lose weight. So even when fat women have health insurance in the US, for instance, right? Even when fat women have health insurance, they avoid doctors because of that constant disrespectful treatment, the embarrassment of being weighed or being ridiculed for their weight, and the negative attitudes of providers, of having doctors give them unsolicited comments or advice on using or losing weight. So these are just some of the, basically the horrifying but unseen fat biases that exist out there. And the coping mechanisms, as we saw from the study that I just mentioned, is that fat people withdraw. And if you keep withdrawing from public spaces, public transportation, visiting your doctor, hanging out with friends, going to a restaurant, if you keep missing out on these experiences, your physical, mental health gets impacted in a negative way. You miss out on just basic human contact, on socialization, on networking opportunities, on growing your social network. And that can have career ramifications, that can have mental health ramifications. So I just want to leave you with how important it is for all of us to be lifelong learners, to educate ourselves about the experiences of what other people are going through, and experiences of people that don't live your life, that don't look like you, that didn't grow up like you, so that we can all sort of have that common humanity that's so important, and that self-compassion that's so important, so that we could be and understand the importance of being allies with each other. I think that's all I had to say for today about thin privilege and fat bias and discrimination. There's so much to unpack. I haven't figured out what I'm going to do. I haven't figured out what we're going to talk about next week, because I have like 5 different ideas. I don't know if we should go into trans health, if we should talk about that, because I actually have a book that I want to finish reading this week, and I thought I could talk about that, called Becoming Hope. What a wake-up message. Oh, I know, if you don't know about this, I mean, that's the thin privilege, right? But if you talk to any person who has lived these experiences, this is not a shock to them. And that these sort of biases, unless they're checked, can have detrimental impacts on fat people from elementary school to high school to higher education to the workforce. I'd actually like to do an Instagram live and have on with me some of the body activists that have come your class. Oh, hi, Jennifer. Oh, yes, Jennifer, we talked about that, right? That was Conestoga, right? With all the nurses. Yeah, I mean, it's something that healthcare professionals have to be aware of. And I encourage everybody to read the lived experiences from fat people themselves. Read their books. The Body is Not an Apology is a great website for more resources, and I can actually send you some pictures of memoirs from body activists. And yeah, so I think that's all I want to say. Unless anybody had any questions, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Thank you for joining me. And if you can't, as always, if you can't catch these live, you can always watch them on my YouTube channel. We try to get them up in a few days, but it usually makes its way later on the week on my YouTube channel. All right, everybody, I'll let you get back to, are the Leafs playing right now?
It's 2-1.
Oh, it's 2-1. For the Leafs?
For the Leafs.
For the Leafs. Ooh. Okay, thank you, Rosalie. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, Marin. I would like this as a podcast. Yes, I know I should do a podcast. Gosh, but that's one more thing I need to do. Yes, everyone keeps saying that. I have to figure that out. I actually have all the podcast equipment. I don't know. Are we going to do that? Are we going to try that? We got to figure something out. Yeah, Jennifer, you would like that? But it would have to be short, right? How long are these podcasts? Like 20 minutes? Is that enough? Like to listen to on the way to work or something?
Joe Rogan's 2 hours.
Well, I'm not doing Joe Rogan 2 hours. Yeah, but it's okay to say no. I know, Well, actually, I feel like a podcast would be just like another iteration of this. So can't we tape this as we're doing it live, tape it as a podcast?
Yeah,
I bet you we could do that. I bet you we could try to hit 2 things. 30 minutes or less is pretty, I would think so. Yeah. Hi, Alessandra. We're just about to leave, Alessandra. The Leafs are playing 2-1. Okay, thank you, everybody.